All right. Once again, thank you everyone for joining. This is Incrementality, our Incrementality webinar, really part two. So for those of you who had joined maybe the last one, we went really deep into p-values and r-values, and all of that is so much fun. And we're definitely going to be testing all of your previous knowledge here. We wanted to take another go around now that Podscribe has implemented some new features to this tool, and then just take the time to really walk through and make sure that everybody has a clear understanding of what incrementality testing and conversion testing or conversion lift testing are, and what we test for, why it's beneficial, and all of that great stuff. I'm joined by Matt Drangler, our head of partnerships. There is not a more perfect person to be walking through this. He taught me everything that I know in terms of incrementality. He's got about a decade of experience in the audio measurement space, probably working for almost every single attribution company out there. Yeah, again, not a more perfect person to help us understand and walk step by step through what really incrementality is.
Thank you, Amelia. Should we dive right in?
Let's dive right in. All right. So yeah, Matt, kick it off. Incrementality, attribution. What is incrementality? What's the difference between attribution? If you're using attribution, why would you use incrementality? Let's just start from there at a high level.
Perfect. We're going to start high level. We're going to scratch beneath the surface, maybe a couple of layers. So the goal here is that if you know nothing about incrementality, you're going to learn more. If you know some about incrementality, we're going to start to scratch beneath the surface a bit more, maybe even make your understanding even better over time. What is incrementality? Let's start answering that question by first defining what is just standard attribution. Standard attribution is this idea where we have some sort of a signal or data coming in on ad exposure. We have a signal that comes in, let's say, on an advertiser's website or app, and we attempt to match those two things together to try and answer questions like, who of the listeners that were exposed to my ad made a purchase? Now, when you start looking at the results as they're coming in, there's other questions, especially for larger advertisers, that start to bubble up in their minds. They ask questions like, so of those people that were exposed to these audio ads, do they also see my Facebook ads? Do they already know about my brand? How much of these conversions would have happened anyway because of all of these other marketing channels? That's the thing, is that when you're looking at just an attribution platform, what it is measuring is all that it's measuring. In other words, it has no idea about all of the other marketing efforts that are going on for a given advertiser unless that data is flowing through that platform. And so incrementality is the idea that we can remove sort of the noise from all of these other channels and all of the other word of mouth that's going on to truly isolate the impact of the audio channel efforts. It starts to make it easier to compare our audio channel efforts to the other channels that are live that advertisers and agencies are currently measuring the effectiveness of and comparing the effectiveness of those channels to the podcast channel. Again, it allows us to, in a more direct way, compare results from audio campaigns to all of the other channels that are being run by a given advertiser. So very high level, that is what incrementality is. Now, there's a lot of confusing terminology that's used in incrementality. Frankly, people who have a lot of knowledge and people that have no knowledge will use different language. And I'm here to try and debunk how challenging incrementality can be. When you hear terms like incrementality, lift, test and control, geo holdout testing, so on and so forth, at the end of the day, these are all describing the same thing. And they're all describing the same thing. Amelia, you want to go to the next slide real quick? There it is. They're all describing the same thing. What they're describing is a measurement process where we have things like an exposed group and a control group. Don't worry, we're going to dive in on those topics more. And they are comparing the performance between those two to calculate lift or incrementality. So they're all effectively talking about the exact same thing. Now, what is probably the most common misconception in the industry today is that there is a lot of similarity, or should I say brand lift and conversion lift are considered the same thing. And they are very different things. And I want to make sure that we define this so that way it's clearer within the industry about what is being talked about when Podscribe talks about lift versus, let's say, Kantar or Nielsen talks about lift. And the difference here is brand lift versus conversion lift. Brand lift quite literally is trying to measure how do the listeners feel or what do they intend to do after exposure. And we answer these questions based on a survey. So we find people, we ask them to take a survey, they tell us how they feel, they probably confirm that they think they heard an ad or was exposed to an ad for a given advertiser, and they'll allow us to maybe suss out, did we win the hearts and minds of these people? Now, the interesting part about these brand lift studies is that the sample size, the number of people that are taking these surveys is small. I put an N equals 200. That means there's 200 people that took the survey. And sometimes that means it's 200 people took the survey that were exposed to the campaign, and then 200 people took the survey that weren't exposed to the campaign. And it allows us to calculate a lift in perception or a lift in intention, so on and so forth. That is not what Podscribe is talking about today. Podscribe is talking about conversion lift. So rather than identifying, hey, do we have more brand awareness or do more people intend to buy? Instead, what we're answering is, did more people buy based on this lift study? And it ensures that what we're doing is, first of all, looking at a very large sample size. Pretty much every household that is exposed is eligible to be tracked and measured for conversion lift studies, which means we go from a brand lift study, which has 200 people that were questioned, to a campaign with 1 million impressions that hits 500,000 households. Well, the sample size for that conversion lift study is 500,000. So we have a lot of belief in the results that we're seeing because of the scale. So that's the difference, brand lift versus conversion lift. When we, Podscribe, are talking about lift, we are talking about conversion lift, and it allows us to calculate things like what's the incremental cost per acquisition, what's the incremental return on ad spend, so on and so forth. So hopefully that clarifies things for folks.
Great, awesome. So yeah, maybe you're using attribution, maybe you're not. If you are using attribution or using Podscribe's attribution, Matt, why would an advertiser, an agency, or even a publisher want to test for incrementality and use it in particular?
Yeah, so a few things. One, let's talk a little bit about the podcast industry specifically, and then let's start to maybe branch out a bit more for audio in general. The first thing that I'll say is something that is completely underrepresented, or should I say, the podcast industry is completely underrepresented within these very large mathematical models that advertisers and agencies are using to determine if the performance of their campaigns is worth putting more money into or taking money out. Essentially, it is an omni-channel view of performance, and it helps to answer things like, hey, what is marketing's contribution to revenue based on the amount of spend in all the different channels? And there's other things that it's beneficial for. But here's the point. The podcast industry specifically is not being piped into these media mix models today. In some instances, they are, but in most instances, they are not. And what incrementality testing allows us to do is provide a number where an advertiser or an agency can compare the performance to these media mix models, essentially allowing us to bring the podcast industry onto the same stage as display and banner ads and out-of-home billboards and other things that are being piped into the media mix model. So that's why testing for incrementality is important. It allows us to make sure that things like the podcast industry is in the conversation when it comes to marketing channel mix, planning out your next campaign, optimizing your budgets, or allocating budgets towards certain channels. It also allows us to understand, sorry, Amelia, go back one more real quick. It also allows us to understand some of the most important things, which is, hey, now that I see results, where do I buy next? How do I change my media mix, or how do I change my allocation of spend from one publisher to the next? Incrementality allows us to have a lens where we can see all other channels as a part of these results, but using these results to influence my optimizing decisions or optimization challenge or optimization solutions. It puts us in a place where we're now competing apples to apples with all of those other channels that I mentioned before. So that's why we test for incrementality. How do I know if I need incrementality? Now, this is an interesting question. If one of the things that is, I think, maybe apparent based on what we've talked about is how much behavior or activity is there in the marketplace today across other channels for that given advertiser. If an advertiser is spending 50% of their budget on Facebook and let's say 10% of their budget on podcasts, then it becomes really important for us to understand what the incrementality is of both of those channels. And those types of advertisers that spend a significant amount of money will rely on incrementality to influence their decisions in terms of buying media within a channel, optimizing their budgets, so on and so forth. Another piece here too is if an advertiser, let's say, has a lot of brand awareness, Geico, Progressive, these major insurance companies have a ton of brand awareness. And the reality of the situation is that brand awareness can drive noise in your standard attribution results. And so these types of brands that are spending billions of dollars a year, they are requiring that the measurement is in incremental numbers rather than standard attribution, because they won't look at it any other way. That is probably the most ideal candidate for the folks that are using incrementality today. And Amelia, if you want to go to the next slide, you see something very interesting, and perhaps this is maybe obvious. Now, this graph is a gross overgeneralization. This is just meant to be like wet finger in the air. Is the incrementality numbers, do they make sense to me? And here's how you read this graph. So from left to right, what we're talking about is the scale of audience that's going to an advertiser's website. So from 0 to 1, from 1 to 5, 5 to 20, 20 plus million on a monthly basis. What we found is the more people that are going to the website, typically the more spend that is happening from an advertiser, or the higher the brand awareness or brand perception is of a given advertiser. And so what it means to us is usually that means that the podcast or the audio slice of the budget pie is smaller. And it's why we see things like larger brands that get 20 plus million visits on a monthly basis, or visitors on a monthly basis, sees lower lift. It's because audio channels are competing with all of those other channels even harder, because they're spending significantly in other channels, or their brand awareness is very high. Now, conversely, if we look at the other side of the graph, smaller companies that maybe don't have as much brand awareness, but let's say are spending significantly for them, but in just a few channels, we expect to see more incrementality from those types of brands, primarily because they're, again, the audio space is then not competing with those other channels as much. So general trend, this was from our PPB report, or the Podscribe performance benchmark report that we released just before Thanksgiving. Make sure you have a copy of it. But this is a great representation of what do we expect in terms of lift and incrementality from advertiser to advertiser. And by the way, if you have questions on what these percentage numbers mean, we're going to go in and we're going to do an actual calculation to show you what they mean. So stay tuned for that.
All right. So let's go into incrementality, Matt, is not necessarily like brand new to the audio space. And it's definitely not new to other marketing channels. But there are definitely some problems with historical incrementality solutions. And that's one of the reasons why Podscribe wanted to take incrementality to the next level and provide a solution that was more realistic to how you would actually use this tool. So maybe talk to us a little bit about what the legacy incrementality challenges are and have been.
Yeah, so one of the biggest, I would say, legacy challenges we hear about is audio is really challenging to measure from an incrementality perspective. And we aim to debunk that myth, obviously. It is not a challenging channel to measure from an incrementality perspective, but definitely one of the legacy challenges. A few other things that are in here, right? Incrementality studies are usually like a PDF or a tear sheet. It's like a moment in time view of lift or incrementality. And oftentimes those style of studies show up, I don't know, like 3, 4, 8 weeks after a campaign has ended, something like that. And one of the biggest complaints there is, how do I use this to influence my spend if it's not if my report is not showing up until well after my campaigns are over? So that's another really challenging thing from an incrementality perspective, is we're used to seeing results late, and maybe if it's a seasonal event, we can use those results for the next campaign next year, but certainly not helping me this year in driving my numbers. So definitely a very large problem. And then I think another one that's really important to call out, aside from studies being like one-off and are really expensive, is a lack of granularity. How do we see the incremental impact, not just at a channel level, but also at a publisher level, as well as a line item, or what we call campaign level? Now we can make actual line item level, show level optimizations based on incremental numbers, based on some of the solutions that we're starting to provide here to the marketplace. So not to jump the gun, but if we go to the next slide here, what we propose is that the best solution for the industry is an always-on incrementality solution. It's not something where we have to wait for results. It's something where we can see results right in the dashboard that are updating live as new results are coming in. And it allows us to make those optimization determinations while a campaign is live. And it also allows us to break down results, not just at the channel level, but also at the publisher and the line item level. So this always on incrementality solution starts to address a lot of the legacy incrementality challenges that we have heard about over the last few years.
So that is all great. Let's dive into the meat of it, Matt. How does incrementality work at a high level? And then how does incrementality work for podcast advertising, audio advertising, and then specifically with what Podscribe is doing?
Let's dive in. I'll call this out. This slide right here is something that I used to draw on a whiteboard for all of my conversations to explain how incrementality studies work. And so this is, I don't know, 8 years of fine tuning to try to make this as easy as possible. So let's see if we can go through this and we can maybe declutter or defog what is the idea of a test and control group and what does it mean. So let's talk from the lens of the exposed group. These are the people that are being exposed to the campaign that's being measured. And remember that first question that I asked, which is like, cool, great results. But of those people that were they exposed to other channels? Well, the concept here is that the exposed group should absolutely have been exposed to other channels. It's not likely that we're going to find podcast listeners or other audio listeners and they haven't been exposed to other channels necessarily. The concept here, the example that we're given is, hey, here's an exposed group. That exposed group was exposed to the podcast campaign. You can see that by the green check mark on the bottom left. But those individuals were also exposed to direct mail, to paid search. Let's say they weren't exposed to linear TV, but they were also exposed to maybe some organic or some paid social campaigns. So all of these things in concert, plus things like word of mouth and general brand awareness, these things in concert are driving conversions to happen already with the advertiser. So now the question becomes, I only want to see that green check mark in the bottom left. I only want to see podcasts in this instance. So the way that we remove the results from all of those other channels is we build a control group. This control group is designed to look as close or exactly like that exposed group. The only difference between the exposed group and the control group is that the control group was not exposed to this podcast campaign, but the exposed group was. And you can see that being denoted in those two different columns there. Both of these groups, exposed and control, have been exposed to social, linear TV, paid search, and direct mail. The only difference is the podcast. Now you can imagine then that the results that we're seeing from the control group based on all of this brand awareness and all of these other channels, that the rate with which they're converting already is due to those other channels in aggregate and due to that brand awareness in aggregate. So if I subtract the results of the control group from the results of the exposed group, what I'm left with is the conversions that wouldn't have happened if this campaign never existed. And it allows me then to calculate what is the percentage lift compared to a control group, or what portion of my attributed conversions are incremental. And you can see that on the graph on the right. So the graph on the right here, let's consider this as time on the x-axis, conversions or count or number of conversions on the y-axis. That gray box, conversions that would have happened anyways, those are all of the conversions over time that happened because of all of these other channels and word of mouth that is influencing the exposed and control groups equally. And when you see that yellow line go up and to the right, what that's showing is those are the number of conversions that are over and above that gray box or that noise. So if you see quite literally, if I take, let's say, the peak of that yellow line, which is an X number of conversions, and I subtract the gray box from it, then all of a sudden what I'm left with is the incremental conversions that are associated with the campaign that's being measured. So that's the gist of how incrementality studies work, super high level.
Yeah. Any questions? This is really important to understand before we dive in a little bit more detail.
And if everybody here already knows this stuff, wonderful. We're starting to do our job already.
All right, everybody's got it. Great.
Silence is a good thing, all right? What we have done in the background in creating this sort of always on process is we've created a 3-step process that continues to repeat in the background without any sort of effort on any Podscribe clients. So what this means is that there is nothing additional that needs to be done in order to suss out incremental results from Podscribe. Here's how we do that. Let's dive in on first. We create a control group. Amelia, you want to go to the next slide? So we create a control group. Podscribe has anywhere from 3 to 5 billion impressions that are flowing through the dashboard on a given month. It's a significant number of impressions. And with those impressions, we know a few things. We know things like what is the region or the location of those impressions as derived from the IP address. We also know things like what are they listening to, because we get information like what streaming audio station are they listening to? What podcast are they listening to? How many podcasts do they listen to? And the idea here is if we know that information, we know that about the exposed group, and we also then can create a control group that looks just like the exposed group in terms of the region where they are and their listening behaviors. And so when we're creating this control group, we are holding those things constant. The idea here, or the theory, is that if we hold those things constant, then the way or the amount with which people are being targeted by all these other channels will be equal between control and exposed. And that's what allows us to make the assumption that if we subtract the control group from the exposed group, we get lift or incrementality, which takes us to the next slide.
And just real quickly here, Matt, again, the goal of creating a control group is finding individuals that are listening to podcasts that are very similar, as you mentioned, if not identical to the ones that are going to be exposed.
Yep. So they're supposed to look absolutely identical to the exposed group. The only difference between them, one was exposed to the campaign, one was not. So we've done the first step. We've created the control group. Now we compare. So here's a little math. Don't be too frightened. These are not super challenging equations here, but let's just set up an example so we all understand how is lift or incrementality actually calculated. And here's how we do that. Let's say we have a campaign. That campaign ran 1 million impressions. That's the test line item in that table right there, the green one. With that 1 million impressions, oh, thank you, Amelia. With that 1 million impressions, 28,000 people went on to convert, 2.8% conversion rate. Great. So that was the performance of the test group. Now, remember that last slide. Podscribe went and we created a control group that looks just like the exposed group. And we observed that those households were converting at a lower rate. So out of 1 million control impressions, we saw 19,600 conversions, and with a conversion rate of 1.96%. Okay, we have our two response rates between control and test. And so now we can do our calculations for lift, incremental, and what's called incremental conversions or gain. If you wouldn't mind, Amelia, maybe backwards here. Perfect. Let's talk about lift and lift percent. The way that we calculate lift, or should I say, let's just define it. Lift is this idea of what is the percent change or percent growth in performance of an exposed group over and above the control group. So in order to do that, all we do is we take the difference in the conversion rate between test and control, 2.8 minus 1.96. And in the denominator, we just put the control group. In other words, what is the percent growth of the performance when comparing the exposed group to the control group? And in this instance, it's 43%, or the lift of this campaign was 43%. Now, here's the thing. When we're looking at these numbers, sometimes it's really challenging to kind of ground yourself and understand, what is lift really telling me? How do I use a lift percentage to influence some of my marketing decisions? How do I really ground that idea in reality? We found it's a little bit more difficult to understand lift percent because most people don't think about the performance in terms of a control group. They just think about performance in terms of what are my numbers? What were the incremental numbers? And so what we like to do is we like to flip this around a little bit. So rather than looking at lift percent, we look at incremental percent. And here's how we'll talk about how we do that in a second, but here's how it's different. So while lift is showing percent growth over a control group, incremental percent is saying of the portion, of all of the attributed conversions in standard attribution, what portion of those are incremental? It's almost, hey, I have 100 conversions and 20% of them are incremental. That means I have 20 incremental conversions, and that's what incremental percent helps to suss out. Calculation is very similar. You still have the gain, so 2.8% minus 1.96, and in the denominator, it's 2.8%, or the conversion rate of the test group. Again, that helps us to say what portion of standard attribution is incremental. That's a much easier thing for folks to understand. So again, that's how we calculate it.
That 30% then means that of all of the 100 conversions, 30% of those are incremental, meaning they would not have converted if they were not exposed to the ad.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So that's what the audio channel drove.
Great.
So that's comparing.
All right. Yeah.
Okay, this next slide we're going to go through relatively quickly, but for those of us that are more deep into the numbers, one of the questions that gets asked all the time is, how certain are you in these results? You may have been in conversations and some people might ask, what's the stat sig, also known as statistical significance? The idea here is we're running a test, and this test is not all-knowing. It's not perfect. And it could be that if we ran this exact same test 100 times, perhaps we don't get the same result. That is possible, and that is normal in the world of statistics. So the idea is how do we make certain that the results that I'm seeing are repeatable. Will we see a similar result every time we run this test in a parallel universe? And we use what's called confidence intervals to suss that out, or to define how certain we are in those results. So thank you, Matt, for coming. We really appreciate you. So the way that we're doing that today is we look at the results and we calculate these confidence intervals. What a confidence interval is saying is, hey, you have an incremental percent of 30%, like we looked at in the last slide. But we actually believe the real answer is anywhere between 25% and 35%. So what I just described is a lower bound and an upper bound. Now, the more narrow the difference is between upper and lower, the more certain we are in the results. The wider that band is, or that difference is, the less certain we are in the result. And so the way then that we are showing this within the dashboard, which we'll do a live demo here in a second, is anytime we see a result with a green dot, that means this confidence interval is small. Anytime we see a yellow, it's a little bit bigger. Anytime it's gray, it's so big we don't feel confident in even showing you what that number would be. And what we'd recommend in those types of scenarios is either A, you'll never get stat sig if it's a pretty decent sized campaign, perhaps not driving any incrementality, but you could also be saying that you haven't spent enough on that line item because it's not popping, we don't have enough numbers to see it, it's not breaking through the noise, as it were. And so that's how we use confidence intervals to allow at least the folks that need a bit more statistical rigor, how they can feel confident and comfortable in the results that they're seeing. So that is validate.
All right, those 3 steps. And again, as Matt, you mentioned, it's ongoing, it happens in the background. There's no turning on, turning off. We are constantly, for every campaign and every impression, creating that control group, measuring that lift, and then validating that with the confidence intervals, and it just keeps going.
Got it. Exactly right.
All right, so then does everybody on this call, how do advertisers, how do agencies, how do publishers start to use incrementality? What do they need to do in order to get this set up? Do they need to do anything? And what does that look like?
Perfect question. All of the complexities that we just talked about, all the things that could feel like they're advanced topics, you don't have to know all of that stuff to start using incrementality with Podscribe. Quite literally, launch your campaigns. We do have some thresholds that need to be hit in order to start measuring these things with a high or with really skinny confidence intervals, like 1 million impressions over 1 month.
I just wrote you back. Yeah.
Amanda, would you mind muting yourself for us really quickly?
Sorry about the delay. So I hit up our audio person.
Amelia, you're perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so from that perspective, once you hit that threshold, starting to look at incremental results is at the flip of a toggle. So if quite literally, if you flip the toggle in the dashboard, you can start seeing incremental numbers. You don't have to know the control group stuff. You don't really have to know any of the math behind it. At the end of the day, what you're then seeing is, rather than the standard attribution, let's say showing you 100 conversions, it will show you the 30 conversions that are incremental, allowing you to report on incremental numbers only. So that is how simple it is to work with us on that. This is a great slide, and it's a great leave behind slide. So you can see really quickly, what do I do with this information? How do I analyze the data? How do I turn it on? So on and so forth. I think it might be easier for us to actually go in on a live demo.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Matt, we'll have you pass it.
Amelia, just make sure that I can share my screen real quick.
Yep.
Thank you. All right, let's look at incrementality. Okay, so what we see here, this is a demo dashboard. This demo dashboard has a significant amount of data in it. It's a lot of random numbers. At this stage, let's not necessarily pay attention to if the numbers make sense because it's demo data, but I do want to make sure that we are showcasing how easy it is to start looking at incremental numbers straight within the dashboard. So I'm an advertiser. My name is Amazing Brand 123. Over the last, I would say, about 2 to 3 months, I've run about 34 million impressions. This is 32 million across podcast, 1 million across Spotify SAI, and let's say 700,000 across YouTube. The results that we're seeing, or the standard attribution results that we're seeing, are showing that we've got a conversion rate, a visitation rate of 1.06%, or about 360,000 visitors. Signups, conversions, we have all of this great data. The next question then becomes, have these people been hit by other channels? How incremental are these results? And to answer that question, click on the toggle. So if I go to measurement and reporting settings, and then I turn on the incremental toggle, click, we'll give that a sec. Boom. Now, everything that you're seeing in this dashboard, with this icon, this little yellow or orange square with an up arrow. It now means you're seeing that number being represented as an incremental number rather than the standard attribution number. So you might have seen the visitors number, which was like around 100 or 360,000. The incremental number is actually 153,000. So now we can start reporting on these things like we're used to reporting on it and just making the caveat, these are actually incremental numbers. The incremental conversion rate, by the way, or should I say incremental visitation rate, is 0.45% in this instance. You can compare this number to things like benchmarks. We do have some benchmarks that are out on this now, at least in terms of percentages, lift or incremental percentages. But this will allow you to see, am I driving good visitation rate or conversion rate based on these incremental numbers? Now you'll notice too that this data at the top, this is showing in aggregate form, how did I perform? These percentages right here are also showing what is my overall incremental percentage. And that's great. It tells me things like, are we driving incrementality with our audio spend? But it doesn't necessarily tell you which parts of the campaign are driving incrementality and which parts are not. And that's where you look at what I call the relative performance table, where we can break results out by placement, show, or publisher, and you'll be able to see incremental numbers, again, denoted by this up arrow. Now, I'm going to add one column here to our view.
Yeah, and Matt, would you mind zooming in a bit? It might be easier for people
No,
to see.
not at all. I do have a giant monitor. That's true. So let me do that. Boom.
Much better.
There you go. Now you can see that little arrow right there. So now when I'm looking at these numbers, I can tell visitors, conversions, conversion percentage, these are all being expressed as incremental numbers. Notice the green dots. That green dot means that the confidence interval is narrow. In other words, we're very certain about these results. As I scroll down, you'll notice they don't all have green dots. This one right here, we don't have enough data to be confident in the results, so we're not necessarily going to report it. And there are some yellow dots in here as well because the confidence interval is a bit wider. But that is effectively what these dots are saying is, can you trust or make optimization decisions based on these results? Green dots, answer is absolutely yes. And so now you'll be able to look at this data in the same way that you've been looking at it using standard attribution, now just replacing these numbers with incremental numbers. Although it's very easy to do, a lot of complex things happening in the background that allow us to do this. But again, as the user of Podscribe, it's very simple to start looking and reporting out on incremental numbers. So that is
Awesome. And again, Matt, will you just show us? So you go to your Podscribe overview tab, and again, there's no extra steps that you have to do. There's no, hey, can you turn on incrementality for us? You literally drop down in the settings and you toggle on incrementality. And as long as you meet those thresholds, which we'll go into a little bit more detail, they're not crazy, we'll be able to show you those incremental results, again, given that confidence interval is high enough.
You got it.
Perfect. Any questions here? Amazing. Connor, I'm looking at you too.
No, this has all been very straightforward, and I was actually just poking around on the incrementals on our end and just enjoying the kind of layered in automatic incrementality we can offer now.
Amazing. Yeah, and we're happy to chat with anybody individually if you want to go a little bit deeper and look at your results. Again, Matt is so great at explaining this, and so we've a lot of clients to help them, diagnose and really better understand those results. So don't hesitate to. We did have a question, Matt, and I think it was answered, but from Todd: are confidence intervals available at the line item/show level, and what thresholds are necessary for that? So we'll get into the impression thresholds in a moment, but Todd, hopefully you saw as Matt was walking through that yes, when you turn that incrementality on and you scroll down to the line items by campaign and by show and by publisher, we will show you in the form of those green, yellow, or red dots what those confidence intervals are, and even an explanation for what's needed.
You've got it. Exactly right.
Amazing. All right, so let's go back. I will share my screen and we will move on. Just a couple last things. Matt, let me know if you can see this.
Got it.
Perfect. All right. So let's now go into the best practices. Again, Podscribe doesn't require you to completely update your campaign structure or your buying cadences practices and whatnot, we do have some best practices to make sure that if incrementality is really important, especially for a certain campaign or testing with a certain publisher, that you can set some things up so that you're going to get the most statistically significant results. But yeah, Matt, let's dive into what those thresholds are and really what those best practices for using Podscribe's continuous always on incrementality look like.
Yeah, first best practice, just flip the toggle. So that's the next thing. Second best practice here is like, how do we assume that our volume of impressions is feasible, or how is it going to drive statistical significance? Our thresholds are we have to run at least 1 million impressions per month at a overall measurement level in order for us to enable the always on incrementality view across both line items as well as publisher level. From that perspective, it is slightly higher than what we've heard from others in the space, but it gives us a lot of benefit. We don't have to wait for the results to come in way after the campaign. This feasibility, this 1 million impressions, it makes it so that we have a lot of data to act on during the campaign while it's live. That's the first thing. Second thing is pixel placement. Now, when we say pixel in this instance, this is an advertiser's website pixel. And the idea here is when we are creating these control groups, we don't just create them and assume that they're working well. We create them and we run some very complex tests in the background to ensure that in places where, let's say, the control group and the exposure group have not been exposed to either thing, they should be performing pretty much at the same rate. Now, what helps us to do that sometimes is by placing a site pixel prior to any of the campaigns even launching. What it allows us to do is to measure a dark period, how many conversions are already coming in, and it allows us to train our control groups to be as good as they possibly can be. When this pixel is placed a few weeks before, it means you have more green dots on your screen. But if we don't do it, it's no worries. But to be totally transparent, I would say 95% of advertisers can't do this in time. In lieu of that, we have a lot of great solutions to control and, should I say, to validate our control groups. This is just a best practice or recommendation from a pixel placement perspective. And then the last thing that I'll call out is we really would love to see more than like a couple of weeks of data before we start actually operating on this incrementality data. Ideally, we have 6 weeks worth of data. And that will allow us to have enough information, enough impressions, and enough attribution in order to run statistically significant lift results. And so we say running for at least 6 weeks is probably the most ideal. It's where you'll start to see your lift results stabilize. And so, yeah, 6 weeks, that is the best practice.
Great.
And at the end of the day, as we talked about in the very beginning of this call, incrementality topic is challenging. It can be difficult to either understand or to talk to our bosses about or anything like that. Bring us in. We're willing to have those conversations. We're willing to, through the 101 that we just talked through, to make sure everyone understands or dive as deep into the methodology as necessary. If we're talking about an analyst or someone who doesn't know numbers, we can be there to help at all layers of those conversations. So
amazing. And the last thing, again, you have to be using attribution, Matt. There's no, we just want to set up incrementality. So with attribution and pixel-based attribution, or PBA, as we like to call it, is the necessary first step in order for us to even quantify that incrementality, because those two things work together. If you're not using Podscribe attribution or even pixel-based attribution, again, we'd love to walk you through what the benefits are and how it works. But with pixel-based attribution, it allows us to unlock these other advanced measurement tools to help better understand what performance for audio looks like. Amazing. All right. So we have a little bit of time, Matt. We just walked through high level a case study. Again, if you're using pixel-based attribution with Podscribe, you can view incrementality. As Connor was saying, he's going in his dashboard right now and looking at some of the results. I definitely encourage you to do that. Then just go start to check stuff out. If you click on some of those buttons over the incrementality numbers that Matt was showing, you'll actually see some of those graphs start to populate, and you can see that lift line and things like that. Definitely encourage you to at least just go in and start looking at it. And with this, because there's no, hey, that's an extra $50,000 to run incrementality, because it's always on with Podscribe if you're using pixel-based attribution, we're seeing a lot of really impressive results when it comes to the advertisers that we work with. And so we did a case study recently, maybe some of you saw it, but with the agency Podscale, looking at across a number of their brands, specifically in the D2C space, some of those really high, everybody's heard of them, but high performing, high growing brands that, again, Matt, have a lot of brand awareness and are spending a lot on other channels, what they saw. And again, the challenges that they had proposed to their original advertisers to get them to use pixel-based attribution and incrementality are all the things that we mentioned before. It's hard to isolate the true impact. Sometimes historically there's been a lack of reliability with incrementality testing. Again, not every brand has $50,000 to spend on an incrementality test. That's only going to look at a certain 3-month window. That again, they can't really use those results to apply to future campaigns and where they should buy next. And so we analyzed across a number of pod scales advertisers, again, D2C brands, fast growing with a lot of spend, and specifically the Facebook and the Googles. And we saw some really impressive results. Overall, across those advertisers, about a 2.56x ROAS, incremental ROAS, meaning that their actual attribution ROAS was much higher, but they wanted to understand what the incremental, and they were able to drive around $3.9 million in incremental revenue, which again, if you're an advertiser trying to justify to your director of marketing or growth, these are really important numbers to have, because all advertisers are going to get questions around, well, how do we know that it was podcasting which drove that conversion? For agencies and publishers, same sort of thing. Oftentimes there can be some pushback on, well, is podcast advertising really working? All of those same questions. We're working with a lot of agencies that are building out and updating their reports to include these incremental results, because it just helps bring that confidence of podcast advertising and even other forms of audio advertising, streaming, things like that, and show them in a net new quantifiable way what the actual incremental impact of podcasts are. And again, answer the question, should we continue spending in podcast ads, or should we maybe put that budget somewhere else? Really great results here. We're doing a number of other case studies with some advertisers. But again, this is just an actual instance where we looked at a number of advertisers and were able to quantify these impressive results immediately. Anything else you'd add there, Matt?
No, I think that's perfect. That's exactly
right. Great. And that's it. Again, if you're using Podscribe already, go check out those incremental results. Just switch that toggle on. We're here to help. As Matt mentioned, we're here to jump on a call and help you interpret them, walk through them and stuff. Don't hesitate to reach out. If you're not using Podscribe or you're not using pixel-based attribution, maybe you're an agency that uses this for air checks, but you've got an advertiser that's maybe pushing back on, we're not seeing enough promo code redemptions, or they want to understand the actual incremental impact. Podscribe is a great solution. We'd be happy to walk you through a demo. Again, if you are not an existing customer and you go into our request demo section of the site and just mention webinar, we're happy to offer around 20% off for your first 2 months so that you can start seeing that data. And again, making that case for podcast advertising a little stronger. So yeah, again, send over these slides and we'll send over the recording. Give us a couple of days to at least edit some of it and make sure it's perfect. And yeah.
Perfect.
Amazing.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us and for sticking with us here. We've got 12 more minutes, so Amelia and I will hang on here. If you've got questions, you want to ask anything live, feel free to come off mute, show us your face, and ask some questions. And if not, no worries. We can talk about other things too.
Yeah, I actually would like to hop in for just a couple quick questions, if I may.
Please, yeah.
And first off, Matt and Amelia, thank you so much for getting this together. This is the amount of times that even just our agency has had to go through incremental lift and what that means with clients. The way this is presented is so delightfully concise. So thank you, both of you, for the presentation and the time. This is all fantastic. My couple of questions were, for the first, just to make sure I understand obviously we're aligned with the recommendations for showcasing and relaying the lift to advertisers because it'll allow for a tighter, more confident window of lift in incrementality. But just to confirm, is the option to toggle on the incrementality available at any point during the campaign, or is it locked until certain thresholds have been met just to avoid that sort of early period viewing?
Yeah, perfect question. So it will be locked until you have enough impressions for a given month to turn it on. So that was that threshold, 1 million impressions over 1 month that we mentioned. Awesome. Now, if we do get lift calculations in the background before we hit 1 million, our system will still turn the toggle on. So you might get lucky. But our general guidance is we need at least 1 million impressions a month. That makes sure that these results are more stable and they're not going to bounce around a whole bunch.
Gotcha. Perfect. And then my next question, and apologies if I did miss this as I was poking around, but if we export or generate reports through the campaigns tab, if we have incremental lift toggled on, is that included in the exports, or is that a different report type that we'd have to pull if we wanted to have all this in a CSV
file? That is such a great question. Let me share my screen here really quickly, and I'll show you.
Awesome.
So let me do that. All right, so I'm going to click on this generate report right here. and I have the incremental toggle on
Oh.
right now. All of these reports right here will show up with incremental numbers when you download them with the incremental toggle that's turned on. Individual conversions and individual conversions of visitors will not. That's like line item level or like log level data. So we're not running any incrementality on those. But these are like aggregated at the day or the week level. So you'll be able to see incremental numbers in those exports right there. So I would say that's the first thing to call out. That would be a good place if you want to pivot things by day, by week, or something like that's good. You could also just download the graph because all of the numbers that are on the graph here would also be expressed as incremental numbers. So that's useful too if you just want these numbers right here. And then the last thing that I'll call out, and we probably should do a better job at how we're titling this, but this export, this is for the real analysts. This is where you're actually seeing things like what is the upper and lower bound from a confidence interval perspective. You're going to see a lot more like averages and things like that. So it dives a bit more into the stats. And I would say user beware. If you're not an analyst, that's not really the report that's going to help you.
Right.
This dashboard and then these exports will help you more, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's great that you have the option to please dive in at that granular level. That's great. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it on my end. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Of course.
Any other questions from folks?
See, we don't have to be scary. Ask
Yeah.
away.
Other use cases people want to talk through? Very cool. Anyone else get any snow yet?
Yeah.
I know I
Donna
did.
can just play our little background music.
Yeah. Maybe
Well,
that's
neat.
it. That's perfect.
Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you, everybody. This was just amazing. Every time we speak and I listen to this, I'm like, oh, now I understand it a little bit better. Again, we are a resource here, whether you are using Podscribe, you're using somebody else, or you're, interested in learning more about it. Please do not hesitate to reach out. Our first name for all of us at podscribe.com. It's as simple as that. We're happy to jump on a call. Again, if you're interested in checking out what Podscribe can offer, we don't just do attribution, verification, error checks, simulcast reporting, very large advertiser show and publisher database. We just launched some new features or things like an actual publisher and show tracker. So if you're interested in any of those things or want to figure out how you can get the most out of Podscribe and the tool if you're using it right now, please don't hesitate to reach out. But thank you again for joining. As mentioned, we'll send over the recording and the slides, and we'll see you guys on the next webinar.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Connor.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Bye,
Thanks,
Connor.
Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day, everyone.
You too. Good to see you, Beth. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. All right. We're good to go.
Nice.
Bye.
Jackie, Mercedes, thanks for joining us. Bye.